Hey everyone, it's 731272 here today, doing another in-depth look. This time we're going to be doing the PowerMac G5. The PowerMacintosh G5, or PowerMac G5, was released on the 23rd of June 2003. It was the successor to the PowerMac G4 and was replaced by the Mac Pro in August of 2006. All PowerMac G5s featured a variant of the PowerPC 970 processor, which was produced by IBM and based off of their Power 4 architecture. At the time of release, it was widely touted as the world's first 64-bit PC and controversially claimed as the fastest computer in the world. At its introduction in 2003, the PowerMac G5 had three models to choose. These models had 1.6 GHz, 1.8 GHz, and dual processor 2.0 GHz. In November that same year, the dual processor 1.8 GHz model was released, replacing the single processor model. The price for the single processor 1.6 GHz model was reduced. In June of 2004, Apple moved to the 90nm process for all of its CPUs, and discontinued the single processor 1.6 GHz model. It was replaced with the dual processor 1.8 GHz, dual processor 2.0 GHz, and dual processor 2.5 GHz models. It's worth noting the dual processor 2.5 GHz model was the first major PC with liquid cooling from the factory. In October of 2004, a new low-end processor 1.8 GHz model was released with a slower front-side bus of 600 MHz. Normally, the FSB speed was half the CPU clock speed. This model only featured PCI instead of PCIX or later PCIe. In April 2005, Apple again increased CPU speeds. The dual processor 2.5 GHz was replaced by the dual processor 2.7 GHz with PCIX and liquid cooling. The dual processor 2 GHz was replaced by the dual processor 2.3 GHz with PCIX and no liquid cooling. Apple also made the 16X dual-layer DVD drive, or as they called it, the Super Drive, standard across its offerings. In addition, internal storage could be up to 800 GB for higher-end models. June of 2005 saw the discontinuing of the single processor 1.8 GHz model in the US and Europe. In October the same year, Apple switched its products from single-core to dual-core processors. The dual processor 2 GHz was replaced by the dual-core single processor 2 GHz, same with the dual processor 2.3 GHz. The dual processor 2.7 GHz was replaced with the dual processor dual-core 2.5 GHz, but the dual processor 2.7 GHz model remained in the market. All models featured DDR2 memory and PCIe, replacing the older PCIX bus. All single-core models except for the dual processor 2.7 GHz were discontinued. Finally, in August of 2006, Apple abandoned the PowerPC platform in favor of Intel. So that's a lot of history for the G5. If you want to know more about the specific models of the G5, I will provide a link to everymac.com in the description explaining all the models in more depth. If you take a look at the case of the G5, you might mistake it for Mac Pros released up until 2013, and that's not unreasonable. The case the G5 introduced was undoubtedly the most long-lived case an Apple product ever featured. Although mine has some blemishes, it really is a truly magnificent case and a wonderful piece of engineering. The G5 case does away with the rather easy-to-break acrylic plastic handles that the G3 and G4 cases featured in favor of aluminum ones. Introduces a well-designed cooling system and many absolutely wonderful little features that make the case great. Moving to the side of the case, you can see the nearly seamless side panel with the subtle Apple logo and the lack of a handle as a G3 or G4 case would have had. In the back, you can see the various vents for the expulsion of hot air, the ports, and the handle to release the side panel, featuring a flip-down plastic locking hole under the handle itself, a nice feature to protect your expensive possession. On the other side, there is merely a completely solid aluminum face with only an Apple logo breaking up the metallic color of the case. Back around to the front, we see another product of the cooling design, the mesh front. All of the little holes allow air into the case to cool everything. Every single one of the holes would have to be clogged with dust in order to deprive this system of the cool air it needs. In addition, There is a wonderfully solid power button, the singular bright white power LED with no HDD LED to speak of. There is a slide down CD cover that is wonderfully smooth and fun to play with, and there are also a few ports on the front for convenience sake. Anyways, moving on. Getting inside the case is as easy as could be. You flip up the lever on the back and simply tilt the side panel down and pull away. The first thing you are greeted with inside the case is the clear plastic air guide that covers the chambers of the system. Taking just a moment to pause and look at the system, any sane human being would be taken aback by the sheer amount of thought that went into making even the insides look beautiful, with large heat sinks of the processors bearing a metal plate that boldly states G5 on both of its processors. On the inside of the front panel, it details the simple process of installing or replacing RAM. Removing the plastic guide and sliding the fan assembly out is all it takes. Inside you can see the DVD drive in its place, and the hard drive caddy with 2 spaces for hard drives, and the expansion bay populated with a GeForce 5200 Ultra. Had this computer been built more recently, the GPU would probably would have had its own metal plate, stating its name in bold detail. Closing the computer up is a cinch, and once you boot the PC up and begin to use it, the only noise you'll hear from the thing is the noise coming from the speakers. It's silent, as Apple intended it to be. I would try to give a time-accurate demonstration, but unfortunately I have no software to do this with. Only a program that loads down the CPU to demonstrate that even under load the system is very quiet. Being an Apple machine with the PowerPC architecture in place, this computer can only run OS X up to version 10.5.8, or some variant of Linux that supports the PowerPC instruction set. This limited it to Apple-supported software and software developed for PowerPC platforms, not including OS 9 or prior applications. Since Intel at the time was all about the megahertz, Apple felt it needed to be as well in order to compete. Apple wanted the G5 platform to be up to 3 GHz within 12 months of its release. This was never realized, even across the entire lifespan of the G5. The highest clock speed the G5 platform ever achieved was 2.7 GHz. There was a cancelled IBM G5 core that would have reached 3 GHz, but only on a single core, at a time when the dual-core chips were already in production. The reason behind this was because the Power 4 architecture was strictly a server processor, meaning it was bent more towards threaded workloads than megahertz. The 970, being based off of Power 4, inherited these server-like properties and consequently simply could not be fed more megahertz without significant changes to the CPU. The G5 also featured a substantial defect in the liquid cooling solution it used for its dual processor models. The liquid coolers would sometimes leak. If not caught promptly, the resulting loss in coolant would destroy the processors, the case, and the logic board as a worst-case scenario. This wasn't fixed until the dual-core versions were released, as a more qualitative cooler was used. Another small problem was that the power supply was a bit noisy, as you can hear here. As I said earlier in the video, when Apple switched to Intel in 2006, they totally abandoned the PowerPC platform and the G5. When they made the switch, your dual processor, dual core G5 was less than a year old and now unsupported by Apple. You most assuredly would have paid over $2,000 for the system new. In fact, Apple not only stopped supporting it, but they also claimed that it was inferior to Intel processors that were quote-unquote twice as fast. Despite the abandonment, the computer would have done its job, and then some. Probably the main reason for buying this system back in the day would have been to do photo or video editing and sensitive sound applications that would have done these things with limited or no trouble. Basic internet searching would have been a cakewalk as well, and even today my G5 can still run some basic web pages pretty well, a testament to how much performance the system has 12 years on. Even though Apple dropped PowerPC like a rock, its software developers largely stay around, and even today there is PowerPC software that is up to date and usable. Only just recently did Dropbox stop supporting OS 10.5. There is even a modern port of Firefox for PowerPC. There are also distributions of Linux that run well on PowerPC G5, Just don't expect the same software base that OS X has. To wrap things up, the G5 was not a particularly revolutionary computer in terms of the hardware it used, but the G5 looked to do many things that its previous generation of computers simply could not, and in that regard, it was a perfect computer. Arguably, the G5 was the computer that defined modern Apple. Although the G5 was certainly not perfect, it left its mark in Apple and outside of it. The company looking to put G5 processors in laptops was later bought by Apple to produce its ARM processors for phones, and the case design the G5 introduced was the staple of Apple case design up until 2013, just 2 years ago. Although the PowerPC architecture was dead and abandoned, without a doubt, it was PowerPC that shaped and nurtured the OS X and the Apple desktop experience we know today. So that's it. Thanks for watching, people. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like and a comment explaining why, as well as any criticisms and helpful feedback you may have. If you have any suggestions on how I can do this better in the future, I'm all ears. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and goodbye.